You are probably familiar with the date of Apollo 11's landing on the moon, but there are more dates that can be equally as important. From 1917 through 1963, the world was in a race to see who could get the first manned mission on the moon. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched a satellite called the Sputnik. America did not like the idea of the Soviet Union getting a head start in the race, so on May 25, 1961, President Kennedy nationally televised that the USA would like to go to the moon, but it wasn't officially confirmed until September 12, 1962, when President Kennedy officially stated,
"We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they're easy, because they are hard."
Since the tragedy of Apollo 1, NASA would not take the chance of it happening again, so Apollo 2 through 7 are unmanned missions to make sure NASA has everything set up right. Apollo 7 took place in October 1967. This flight was successful and paves a bold step in getting to the moon. In December of 1968, the Apollo 8 spacecraft launched. This was a spacecraft that took its 3-man crew all the way into the lunar orbit. In March 1969, Apollo 9 left the ground. It was an orbit test of Earth. Apollo 10 launched on May 1969. It was a dress rehearsal. It flew the whole mission except for the moon landing. And finally, on July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 took off and landed on the moon and came back to Earth.
Arthur Schlesinger Jr. stated, "The one thing for which this century will be remembered 500 years from now was, this was the century when we began this exploration of space." For the famous historian was correct. Space exploration changed the science of the unknown beyond the Earth, but the knowledge of space would have not been known if the men and women of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had not been involved. In an address to Congress, President John F. Kennedy challenged the U.S. to send a man to the moon and bring him back down to Earth safely. Kennedy's goal was the start of the Apollo program. 1959, NASA took hold of the reins of the Apollo project, a mission to enter space in a spacecraft. In 1967, the United States of America had an enemy. A competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had sparked. It was a race to space. The U.S. had the Apollo program, a program manned by NASA and its 34,000 employees. And the Soviets possessed Project Soyuz. John Glenn, a U.S. Marine Corps aviator, became the very first American to orbit the Earth. His successes helped the U.S. win the space race. On the 21st of February, the Apollo 1 launched. Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee, astronauts of the Apollo 1, and the very first astronauts of the Apollo missions, were launched off the testing site on their first manned mission to space. All 3 astronauts died aboard the ship before the spacecraft could exit the atmosphere. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the Apollo 11 on the moon. Both astronauts explored the moon's surface for roughly 2 hours. The Apollo 11's landing and moonwalk were the first events broadcasted live in the world. President Nixon embraced the significance of the landing of the Apollo 11. The president went on a world tour discussing the Apollo 11's success. He created the event into a much larger historical moment. The image of the Apollo 11 proved the United States' power, but ended the public's interest in space exploration. For the world no longer cared about the triumphs of exploring space. The contributions of the men and women of NASA shaped an entire part of history. The knowledge of the beyond had become clear in some factors due to the triumphs of NASA. Through challenges and setbacks, the Apollo program was perfected for each mission. The mark on space exploration history has been made.
Deep within NASA's Kennedy Space Center lies an enormous complex, Launch Pad 39A. It is where Apollo astronauts began their journeys to the moon. On July 16, 1969, the spacecraft Apollo 11 took off from Cape Kennedy, now Cape Canaveral, in Florida, sending Michael Collins, Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong into space. Later, on July 20th, with less than 30 seconds of fuel left, Armstrong piloted the Eagle to a successful touchdown in the Sea of Tranquility.
The Apollo missions of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration made history. Each mission helped the next improve, though many problems and fatal deaths occurred. The Apollo 1, NASA's very first Apollo mission. This mission was the very first manned Apollo mission for the U.S. The ship on the launch pad caught fire, burning the 3 astronauts aboard. The fire was due to the amount of oxygen inside the capsule. Apollo 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 were all unmanned missions in order to make the rockets safer for future flights. The Apollo 7, NASA's first success in the manned Apollo missions. Based off the explosion of Apollo 1, NASA improved the design of the spacecraft with a new Apollo Atlas system. The 7-day mission was manned by 3 pilots who obtained a bad attitude about the missions but proved the spacecraft could be manned and be successful.
On the 21st of December, 1968, the Apollo 8 launched from Cape Kennedy. The spacecraft orbited the Earth and the Moon. On Christmas Day, the Apollo 8 landed perfectly back on Earth. The Apollo 9 tested the landing of the lunar module. The test was successful. The Apollo 10, the last mission before landing on the Moon, successfully orbited the Moon. The spacecraft went into a spin, which could have resulted in the death of the astronauts, but the capsule was quickly able to regain control. The Apollo 11, manned by Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin, was first to land on the Moon. The lunar module landed in the Sea of Tranquility. The Apollo 11 mission was a success. This triumph of having an American place their foot on another world was truly an incredible accomplishment for the United States. On July 24th, the spacecraft with the astronauts successfully made it home. The mission of the Apollo 12 was to land a lunar module on the Moon and retrieve seismic information about the Moon. Roughly 32 hours were spent on the surface of the Moon. The Apollo 12 splashed down each side of American Samoa.
Apollo 13 was an unsuccessful mission. The spacecraft launched, and while orbiting, an explosion occurred. The astronauts on board were able to make it back to Earth alive before any fatal issues happened. Due to the Apollo 13 incident, Apollo 14's launch was postponed. In February of 1971, the Apollo 14 landed on the Moon. Rock samples of the Moon were carried in a special machine which accompanied the astronauts on their mission. 5 months after Apollo 14, Apollo 15 took off to land on the Moon once again. The Lunar Roving Vehicle, or the LRV, transported the astronauts around the Moon to collect samples. This method made retrieving samples quicker and easier. The mission was successful. Apollo 17, the conclusion of the Apollo program, successfully landed on the Moon. 2 of the astronauts stepped out on the Moon and collected 243 pounds of samples. The spacecraft orbited the Moon 70 times, which set a record. After this mission, the Apollo program was terminated.